First, as introduced, my colleague Tedros sitting in the front row, and I'm Conrad. We are representatives of the Ethiopian embassy, and first, of course, thank you so much to the ICD for enabling us, for inviting us to give a cultural contribution to this event. And to start off, a little bit of story time. Over 1,000 years ago, there lived a lonely goat herd in what area can be considered to be later part of the Abyssinian Empire. Khalid was his name, and one day he noticed that his herd, or some goats of his flock, were acting a little bit erratically. They were more active than usual. They were running around like mad. They were bloating quite a lot, and except for the bloating, that is quite un-goat-like behavior. So naturally, he grew worried, because as a goat herd, that was his livestock, that was his livelihood, and if some of his herd would grow sick for some reason or catch something else, then he would be endangered. So what he did is he made some research into the matter, and he discovered that his goats had been nibbling some berries or cherries, he thought, that were growing nearby. These ones. And he didn't know what to make of it. He tried some of himself. He found them quite stimulating, but again, he didn't know what to do with that. And so he got it into his head to go up to the nearby monastery. As the story goes in different ways, sometimes it's mentioned as a Christian monastery, sometimes those are early Sufi monks, Muslim mystics. Either way, doesn't matter, there were monks, and Khalid thought, well, they might know what to do here. So he took his goats, he took some of the strange fruit that he found, and searched out the monks. The monks, of course, immediately knew what to do. They only had one glance at the goats, at the berries, and declared, well, that's obviously the devil's work. Right? So they took the fruit, chucked them into the fire, and the berries started burning, roasting, you could say, and quite soon the whole monastery was filled and pervaded with a quite unique aroma, which in the end convinced the monks that, well, there might be some godly work involved here as well. And that's when they decided to not just ground up the charred remains of the fruit, but also add it to hot water. And they found, well, it made quite a nice beverage. And they vowed from that day on to keep involving it in their daily and nightly devotions, as it turns out. So that's the basic discovery myth of coffee. And Khalid, the goat herd, was said to have lived in what is now the Kaffa region of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia quite naturally prides itself with being the origin nation of coffee. And since we're already grossly over schedule, I would suggest that I will cut down most of that stuff. The important things you need to know is coffee is quite a big deal in Ethiopia, not just because it's the origin nation of it, but because the drinking of the coffee is a highly ritualized process that is enjoyed by all the population, even in parts where coffee is no longer grown. It's usually done in the form of a coffee ceremony, which I'm not going to explain in that much of a detail, actually, because you'll be able to witness it yourself. Anything else you need to know? Well, Ethiopia is not the biggest exporter of coffee today. You might be aware of that. It only accounts for, it doesn't sound that much when I say it that way, but it only accounts for about 4% of worldwide coffee exports, and is still the 5th largest exporter of coffee. It will probably never catch up to Brazil in that matter. That's just not feasible. But Ethiopia is the place with the most diverse selection of Arabica coffee. You may not be aware there are two major strands of coffee that are circulated in the world. It's coffee Arabica and coffee Robusta. Robusta, it is much more easily cultivated. That's why it's spread much farther around the world. But Ethiopia is the sole originator of coffee Arabica, and therefore only grows different Arabica products. The primary coffee research station, and of course Ethiopia has a coffee research station actually. There are multiple coffee research stations scattered over the country. The primary coffee research station in Kafar, the scientists there might even tell you that most of the indigenous coffee species that are indigenous to Ethiopia have not even yet been discovered, because there are large swaths of wild coffee forests where the stuff just grows like that without even being cultivated. I'm not going to tell you any more about the conservation efforts, because I'm quite sure we can cut most of that stuff and simply enjoy the coffee ceremony. Before we do that, I actually we brought you some coffee beans in their dried but unroasted state, because most of you may not even have seen these. Just to have a little tactile experience before you experience the traditional Ethiopian coffee ceremony. Just be prepared. When the ceremony is started, the coffee will be openly roasted. There is incense involved, and by the looks of it, everybody here should be able to get at least one cup. So, originally, we plan to have a little Q&A session as well. So if you have any questions regarding previous presentations that could be relevant to Ethiopia, we would be happy to answer you. Otherwise, if there are no questions, we invite all of you to share a cup of coffee with us.
Okay, so thank you, Conrad, for the brief and nice presentation.